Hey everybody, welcome back to the Personal Transformation Podcast. My name is Dan Storey, and today I'm joined by Bryan Gillette. Now, if you know me, you'll know I like a fitness challenge. I've been a sports person for years. I dabbled in Ironman, forgettably. And right now I'm in my bodybuilding career as a master's physique athlete. And I think I know a little bit about intensity and perseverance and putting in the work. But what we're going to talk about with Bryan today is, I can't even count how many miles, but I'm pretty sure it's north of 200 in an ultra endurance race. So Bryan, I'm looking forward to hearing about that and what you find is the crossover between exercise endurance and business success. So great to have you on the show, and welcome.
Dan, it's great to be on your show, and you know a fair amount if you've done an Ironman about sport and crossover. So I look forward to having this conversation and talking to you.
Absolutely. So I once looked at a website, right? The start of every great story that detailed, I think it was a cross Alps endurance race, and this is an ultra race, and this was about the time when I was doing a little bit of running, and I was in different shape. I say different shape to what I am in now. And the idea of an ultra marathon at the time seemed very cool. It turns out my body is not designed for anything that approaches that kind of distance. It just it gets upset with me. That's the only way I can say it. But the idea of pushing myself to about 50 miles, that was it. I've done a couple of marathons, and 26 is, 0.2 is tough. But the idea of 50, I thought that was a great challenge. Now, you went over 200 miles, right, in your longest endurance race. Is that correct?
It was 205.5.
Which is absolutely either
8
insane.
marathons.
8 marathons. Okay, cool. So take us back. What was the point where you thought that's a good idea, and how did you reach that decision?
Well, I'm not sure that I have reached that decision yet, Dan. So I have been a cyclist all my life, and I love cycling. I cycled across the United States. I've done a lot of long distance cycling, and I was finishing up a 300-mile one-day bike ride. So it was 300 miles, 24 hours, and I thought, I've done a lot on the bike. What next? And I'm always kind of figuring out, how do you push yourself a little bit further? And I never considered myself a runner. I've always been a slow runner. In fact, my parents used to say when I was a kid, they didn't figure out how fast I was going by a stopwatch, but more by a calendar. So as I was finishing up this 300-mile bike ride, I thought, I'd like to be able to run a marathon. And I knew I could do it. As long as, structurally my body stayed intact. And so I knew how to train for long distance events. I knew the mental components. I knew the physical components, just probably similar to you, Dan. You know what it takes if you've done an Ironman or dabbled in that. And I thought, okay, I'm going to do a marathon. Did a marathon, and that went relatively well. And then, as most crazy ideas occur, I was sitting around with a couple friends, and one of them said, hey, there's a 50-mile trail run. And I love being in the outdoors, and so did the 50-mile trail run, really enjoyed it, did a few more 50s, then got the idea, wanted to do 100. And then friends of mine told me about this 200-mile run around Lake Tahoe, 205.5 miles. And Lake Tahoe is just this pristine, high elevation lake. And to be able to run around it was something. And, it's a couple hours from our house, and I go camping up in the area a lot. And I thought that would be really cool to be able to run around that lake and some of the places that I backpacked or camped, and signed up.
Cool. So it was just there. You thought it was a good idea. Okay. Now there's a difference between signing up and getting to the race. So this is one thing I've noticed. I'm a master's athlete. A lot of people sign up for these contests, but on the day, not everybody turns up. Right? They let life get in the way. Something happens. Especially as you get a little bit older, you get a few more responsibilities that come under your belt.
Yeah.
So tell us about that. How did you go from, this is a great idea, I'm going to sign up? What was the length of time until the race, and how did you approach that?
So I had about a year to train for it. And I often tell people when they're thinking about something big, whether it's, if they say, I want to run a marathon, I said, the first thing you ought to do is just sign up. Find one, sign up. If you want to do an Ironman, find one and sign up.
Yep.
And then let's worry about all the other details later. But commit to something. And so, I mean, it's the first step. Or go out and buy a pair of shoes. So I had about a year from the time I signed up until the race. I often, the race, training for the race is the hardest part.
Why do you think it's harder than a race itself?
Yeah, well, with a race, for example, this race, it's 100 hours. You have 100 hours to complete that. So you start at 9 a.m., 100 hours later, all misery is going to be done. Now, in the training, you have a year.
Mm.
And that's a long time. It's a long time for, as you talk about, things get in the way and, it rains. You don't want to go out. You don't want to train, or you think, oh, I'll do it later. And so if you train well, then the race is relatively easy.
Yeah.
And so I often think training, if you can get to the start line, you've done the hard part. And now getting to the finish line is going to be easier than getting to that start line. So work really hard to get to that start line and then enjoy it. So usually what I do, and on these big events, and you probably experience this in the Ironman world, is about 2-3 weeks before, when you start to taper, you start to you're not doing your hard workouts anymore. It's like, okay, the hard work's done. Now I can just relax and enjoy it.
The reason I only dabbled is because I never got to that point with tapering. I still felt I was always climbing. I'm not quite there. So despite putting in a ton of work, I never quite reached the levels that my imagination had for me. And I made it. I completed the half Ironman, very happy. Didn't set any records, but I've got the medal somewhere.
But that's a major accomplishment. And often people will say, look at me and say, "Oh man, I couldn't even run a marathon," and you did 8 of them. It's like, marathon is a major accomplishment. Half marathon is a major accomplishment. So don't measure yourself based on what someone else is doing. Measure yourself on, maybe you can do a little bit more than what you're doing. And so I'm always amazed when somebody completes a half marathon, their first one, or a marathon. You talk about, sometimes life gets in the way, and, you may not show up, or some people don't show up. There's more people that will try to attempt a marathon, and not the percentage of people that don't finish a marathon is much higher than the percentage of people that don't finish some of these ultras, like the 200.
Yeah.
And part of the reason why is you start the marathon and you think, oh yeah, it's going to be easy, I'm going to be fine. And you realize it's hard, and you quit, and you haven't invested a lot of money or a lot of time.
Yeah.
With some of these longer distance ultras, you've invested a lot of money and a lot of time to get to a certain point. And so you don't want to lose out on that. So the success rate's pretty high as you get into some of the longer distance stuff.
Yeah. So that's one of the reasons I like that, the accountability piece, or the investment. If you don't invest into something, rarely do you follow through. Like I find that true in all areas of life. So free stuff is okay, but we get very flaky. I think people are flakier now, and they'll drop things quickly, especially when they're free. So I think the investment thing is important. What else? And we'll get into the business crossover in a minute, but what else is it that you think was different about you? What was? Because some days you're going to wake up, you're going to look outside, and you're going to go, oh, this is a rubbish day for training, or my legs are tired, or my socks are wet, or whatever the excuse is. Something's going to pop into your head. What is it that you focus on or think about? How is it that you get through those moments of like doubt, like not going to do it, like those kind of things? When those pop up, how do you deal with that?
Yeah, I've done so many of these. And so I've gotten in, whether it's a run or a bike ride, and I know what works. I know what doesn't work. I also know that some of the things is you got to be able to prepare for some sort of failure at times, or some days where you get up and you don't want to go out. And so you have to prepare for that. But you also have to mentally prepare that on those days when you wake up and your legs are tired and it's raining, and you'd much rather stay in bed, that if you get up and go, you're going to be better off on race day, and you're going to be more prepared. So I know that. So there were times that I would have to get up at 3-4 in the morning and go run 30 miles, and then be at a kid's soccer game, for the weekend, and then just kind of do all those other weekend activities. And you wake up, it's raining, you don't want to go out. And I just think it's like, okay, if I go out today, I'm going to be better prepared when I show up. And, if it starts raining on race day, I'm going to be able to know that, hey, I've done this before. I've got this. So it's being able to kind of put that mental component in your head and realize that if you do the hard stuff during training, it's going to be easier during race day.
I think I learned this the hard way. It took me a while. It's, this is the idea of discipline. And this was one of the reasons why I took on the bodybuilding. So I really challenged myself to find out if I had that discipline. I knew I could stick to things. I've been disciplined and persistent in the past. But it was a different level. Like it's the same thing, right? I'm going to stand on stage. I'm just going to be in shorts. I'm going to have fake tan and glaze and oil and all these kind of things going on. People can see the excuses at that point. Like if I didn't do a session, I'm going to know, I'm going to feel it. Like there's going to be an element of doubt and something that's in my head that I hadn't prepared at maximum. So you used to be a cyclist. So go back. Was there a point before cycling where you learned the importance of discipline? How did you get to that point where you knew that if you just you had to show up each and every time? Was there some kind of moment in life where you realized that?
Dan, I don't know that there's a moment of where I realized discipline is important. I have always been extremely disciplined, and knowing that the more disciplined I am about certain things, the better chance I will be at achieving what I want to accomplish. And it was funny. I was thinking about this on my run this morning as I was coming back, and I don't look at it. Some people look at it. It's like I'll let fate drive whatever direction I want to go, and something will appear, and I will just go in that direction. That's not my philosophy. My theory is I want to go there. I'm going to focus on going there, and so I become very disciplined at it. And when you look at like training for a run, the 200-mile run, I knew in order for me to be successful, I had to be very disciplined in my training approach. And I had to exercise 6 days a week. I knew what I had to run. I knew what I had to bike. And so I was very focused on that. And on those days that I didn't want to do it, I just kept thinking, if I don't do this today, I'm not going to be successful tomorrow. And so that discipline is just kind of core who I am. And I know we'll kind of talk about this in a little bit, as we cross over into the business side. The people who are disciplined at work tend to be highly successful and very focused as well.
Discipline is one of the ones that I've seen more and more come up in terms of that crossover aspect, is that people who are persistent, they'll follow through, they'll continue to do the things, especially the fundamentals. I think it is being disciplined around the fundamentals, doing the things that are going to get you there regardless, even if it's not, exciting or like fancy and has all the bells on it. It's like, I need to do these core building blocks because that's going to get me there. For me, it's, doing the training, it's eating smart. Like these things are not necessarily terribly exciting, but I know I got to do it. Right? I don't want to go and do all the fancy things. I see some people, Instagram is the worst. Like those people who are throwing barbells around while they're balancing on beams and like they've got an elastic band in their head. I'm like, that's not going to help me at all. It looks great. You go, but none of that's going to work for me.
They may have a different purpose for what they're trying to do. They may be trying to get followers and kind of build that up. You're trying to get into shape, and you know how to do that.
Exactly.
When I was preparing, kind of where I focused on is I like to break things down into this, and you talk about kind of the basic elements. And to run a marathon, whatever it is, I had to break it down into 3 different parts that I had to focus on. I knew I needed to focus on my legs. I needed to make sure that they were strong enough to handle it. I also need to focus on my stomach, make sure I was getting the right food in me, the right liquids, the right nutrition, that I could last for a year of training. And then I also needed to focus kind of up here in my head. So it's kind of that legs, the stomach, and my head is how do you mentally prepare for something like this? Because while it is a physically demanding event, it is more so a mentally demanding event.
Well, let's talk about that because I'm interested. I remember my first marathon, and two mental moments through it that impacted me, and these were almost 20 years ago. I'll say that. One was at 17 miles. I remember 17 miles. And 17 miles, an idea came into my head. It was, hey, you know what's going to be a good idea? Just have a little walk now. Like up until 17 miles, I'd been good. And I was like, that sounds like a reasonable request. Yeah. And so I walked, and 3 seconds later, my legs turned to lead. Like, I don't know, like, all the blood just goes into your legs. So like that was it. And every step after that was pure agony. But that was just a mental thing. It's like, hey, why don't you have a rest? Like, you earned it, you deserved it. And all of these kind of things, justifications come in. You're like, yeah, that sounds like a good idea. And if you listen, then you absolutely broke it. And then the other one was at 24, almost 25 miles. So literally, I had to cross a bridge. I had to cross a bridge, and this is in Nottingham, right? In Home Pier Point. Right? And Home Pier Point is where we do the rowing training for England. And it's 2,000 meters. So you go down, up, and then down again. I remember that third down. So I'm like, same view for 6 kilometers, right? Going past, there was a bank, and there was some people lying down. It was a really sunny day. And I think there was a game of cricket going on just next to it as well. And I was like, you know what? I really want to lie down there. I really want to have a lie down.
Yeah.
And I remember that being so tempting that, like, I still remember it now, that feeling of just wanting to lie down and rest, even though I was so close to the finish line.
What kept you from lying down?
Man, I was like, I can't do that. I can't turn up to anywhere the next day and say, hey, how'd you go? Yeah, I got almost to the end and just had to lie down.
Right.
So knowing that you're going to go 205 and a bit miles, and you had some experience of endurance stuff, what were the points that you knew you had to prepare for? And what were some of the reframes, the different ways of thinking about it that you planned for before the race?
Yeah, and I'll hit your question, but I also want to go back to that lying down, and what kept you going was you knew that if I lied down, I would stop, and you didn't want to have to deal with telling everybody that you failed at mile 25.
Right.
And so it's that why. So the things, I think it was the things that I did to prepare for kind of those challenging times. Was that?
Yeah.
So there's a number of things that I will look at. One is, you're going to hit some bad weather. And so you got to train during bad weather. So those days where I would wake up during training and it was raining and it's like, oh, I'd much rather stay home in bed. It's nicer. Like, no, go out and run, because you can do that at difficult times. And what I did is, over my roughly 9 months of pretty intense training, I gave myself 3. So allow yourself to have some failures. So I gave myself 3 days that if I didn't want to get up and train, go out, no questions asked. I could play that card.
Nice.
Now, that didn't include if there was an injury where it was better for me to stay kind of, or do something different. But it was like, if I woke up and it was raining, and I could play one of those 3 cards, and that gives you a little bit of freedom.
Mm-hmm.
I never played one of the cards. Now, when it was raining, I got up and because I knew it would be tough. The other thing is, I'm really good at putting things in perspective. I was out. Part of my training regimen was I had to do, kind of my last long runs. I had to do 4 30-mile runs in a row. So Sunday, 30 miles, Monday, 30 miles, Tuesday, 30 miles, and Wednesday, 30 miles.
Wow.
So the first 30 miles isn't too bad, at that point, because I'm well trained. Second 30 miles, it's like, okay, it's still not bad. And this is in August, so it's really hot. It's, we're in the high 90s, or kind of the high 30s if you're on Celsius. And so the third day, I'm 10 miles into my run, so I'm already 70 miles in over the last couple of days, and it's hot. I'm tired. I don't want to run anymore. And I thought, God, I just want to stop. And I was starting to whine to myself. My legs are tired. I don't want to go on. And I thought about a friend of mine who was going through breast cancer. And I thought, she's going through something so much harder than I am.
Yeah.
And she doesn't have a choice. She can't stop. She's got to keep going through the pain. It's not voluntary. What I'm going through is voluntary.
Right.
And I could stop, and in a half hour, I'd be sitting on the couch. My legs would be fine. I'd be showered and cool, and everything would be fine. And so I kind of put things in perspective at times and realize that, all right, maybe you just got to stop whining a little bit. and that got me going. Now, what was interesting is I was sharing this story with a friend of mine, and she said, Bryan, that's funny because I was doing the same thing because I had somebody that was going through much worse cancer than I was.
Wow.
And so, when we have these kind of tough times, it's like, how do we put things in perspective and realize somebody's probably gotten through it worse? And how do we going to get through it?
Yeah, no, that's such a powerful story. Last year we lost my dad to cancer, and it would have been 8 years. It's okay. He had a good time, like during that 8 years, and you learn so much from watching someone do that and how they approach it. And he got first diagnosis a long time, and then 8 years, like I said, the last few years, we knew it was terminal. We knew it wasn't going to get any better.
Yeah.
But the way he approached that journey was just phenomenal. And I remember this was maybe just about 6 months before he passed away, just less than that actually. And there's a photo that we've got, and it's at my daughter's birthday party.
Yeah.
We're having a celebration, and there's 4 of us, me, him, my brother, and my nephew on the sofa with Lily in the middle, and the smile on his face. And I still look at I've got it in the video. I still look at that photo and I think, how can you be in that situation where you know that this is going to end and like everything must be hurting everywhere, and yet you're smiling like that, like you're still loving life and living. And I was like, that one photo reminds me of, like you say, the perspective of how we approach things. And there's always someone in such a worse situation. So
yeah. And your dad, what a role model to kind of you, to your daughter, about how you deal with perseverance. I mean, we all know the end is going to come.
Yeah.
When it comes, we don't necessarily know. And so how you deal with that, and it'll be interesting when I get to that point. So, but yeah, it's how are you kind of putting things in perspective? I mean, there's just a number of things like that I look at that helps me kind of get to that finish line.
Yeah, I like the idea. Is what we go through is voluntary suffering. What they go through is involuntary. It's not a choice. It's not
right. Right.
Yeah. So let's move on. Let's go to a happier topic. There's a lot to learn, but let's move on. When did you realize there was a crossover from the intensity, the perseverance, the challenge, everything you took from the endurance running? When did you realize there was a crossover in business?
I had started to see it kind of in my own personal life. Former executive in human resources. I now run my own consulting practice around leadership development. And I saw, all right, as I kind of, some of the same behaviors I would do that would get me to the end of a finish line would be some of the same behaviors I would do that would get me success at work. So I started to see that in my personal life. And then a couple of years ago, I went out and I interviewed 100 people, 100 executives, or kind of elite, some elite athletes, people that had done ultra marathons, had done Ironmans. And I wanted to be able to answer that question that you just asked, Dan. I wanted to understand, okay, where is that crossover, and is there a big enough crossover? And so of the 100 people I interviewed, about 75 of them were in a fairly senior level in their work. They may have been the CEO or some C-level person, founder of a company. And then about 25% were ultra distance athletes. And I just asked them, okay, what gets you to the end of the finish line? How do you deal with risk? How did you get to that point in your career? And all these people had some high level of success. And the answers were the same. It was, we talked about the discipline. It was that confidence. That was ability to persevere. It's the ability to think out into the future, kind of know why you're doing something. If you're starting a company, then you've got to have that why, because there are going to be days that you may not have money to fund payroll. There may be days that, you don't get an approval from some government agency, and what's going to keep you going. And so I just saw tremendous overlap. And And I wrote a book based on those 100 interviews, and that just I kind of tie them all together.
Was there one thing that surprised you, or was there one factor, or maybe a couple or something that surprised you about what correlated between endurance success and business success?
Yeah, I don't know if it really it kind of surprised me. I mean, it reinforced is that ability to think long term. The people that were successful are not thinking 3 months out. They're thinking 10, 15, 20, 30 years out. And so they have that long-term future. They know that 30 years out, they can't accomplish that goal today, but they can break it down and kind of back in. It's like, okay, if I want to be at this point in 30 years, where do I have to be in 15 years, in 5 years? What do I have to do today to get me moving forward?
This is what I'm trying to figure out. And again, I have this conversation, and some people have this future focus, but if you set a really big goal, then oftentimes it can seem overwhelming, daunting, and kind of like, oh, maybe I'll do it tomorrow. We can easily procrastinate taking action. You talk there about the kind of the daily bits. What can I do today? And there's this idea of habits and things along those lines. And then the idea of motivation is that something's always in reach. Like we're challenging ourselves, but we're in reach of it, and we have to work and grow. For such, future thinkers and big picture type people, what is it that motivates them? Is it that? Is it something smaller? Where does that kind of that daily motivation come from?
Yeah, so it's a combination of being able to think way out in the future and understand, why am I doing this? And then, you're not going to have a win, maybe not a win for 20 years or so. So how do you break it down into shorter wins so you can keep that motivation going? And I'll give you a couple examples. One is I'll tie it into the run, but also look at, one of the founders of a company, and one of the companies I worked for, it was a software company, and the founder started it because he wanted to help cure cancer. He was dealing with software. And we had nothing, in a sense, to do with, we weren't a medical company. We weren't, identifying stuff that improved cancer research. But what we were doing is we had software that the FDA, the Federal Drug Administration, used to make approvals on different drugs. And so our software helped kind of manage that process.
Wow.
And so that was his way of contributing. And so he always saw that it's like, we want to help cure cancer. So it's that long-term vision. That's way out there. When I look at the run and kind of how I stayed motivated is when you stand at the start line of a 205-mile run, you can't think about the finish line because it's a long way away. And what you have to think about is, how do I just get to the next aid station? 15 miles away. And I know I can run 15 miles. So I'm going to run 15 miles. I'm going to get food, maybe get a new pair of socks. And then I have to run another 15 miles. And I know I can run 15 miles. And so I can break those down. And in that second aid station, I'm going to see my wife and my kids. So you got to have those small wins that keep you going. So any type of big project or big goal, break it down into things where you can celebrate. You can acknowledge your success, because that's going to keep you going.
There's a big part in psychology, and I look at the psychology of behavior change. And there's a model called the theory of planned behavior, which is this idea that we try and do things, and we have an idea or an intention, and then whether we follow through on. And a large part of that is around self-esteem. And the self-belief and believing in your own abilities, a lot of it comes from small wins. Is having something that I did it. Like you said, it could be as simple as, hey, I bought a pair of trainers. Now what? And that building momentum and that building that belief that actually I can do the next bit and the next bit, and then it just kind of it all falls together. But you've got to cultivate that. You've got to cultivate that by not having a massive goal that you don't reach and you feel like a complete failure, but having either gradients of success or lots of little pieces on the way that are going to allow you to feel successful on the route to a massive goal.
But and you hit it. I mean, confidence builds confidence. And
Mm,
so, and small wins build your confidence. You know, I would talk to these executives in business and I said, okay, when you had a failure, what did you do? He goes, well, we looked at, what happened and we kind of stepped back and we, tried it again. And we tweaked it a little bit and then we got some success there. I mean, whenever you look at somebody that's competing in something and they fall, they get back up and they try it again. And so that builds confidence.
yeah.
Is just the, okay, I'm gonna start and I'm gonna do it small again. If you failed when you're trying to do your marathon, okay, go back and run a half marathon. You can do that.
Yeah.
Get that confidence back up and then run 20 miles. So
When obviously you've been through all of this and you were driven. A lot of people kind of come from a point of being fairly well driven, and especially elite athletes. They've always been elite athletes. They kind of, for many of them anyway, they've been through the ranks until they've got to that. One of the things I talk about in my book is this idea of the trap of average. Is that we get to a point where we've had some success. We're not quite where we want to be, but we've had enough success to be comfortable. We don't want to lose that. So our kind of ambition gets squished a little bit, and we just settle for kind of what we've got. And there's also research about this idea that when we get to a certain age, as generativity versus stagnation. Is do we still want to keep pushing, or do we just want to sit here and just cruise for the rest of time? What advice would you give? So let's say the average person just sitting there like, oh, I feel like I could do more, but I'm not. I'm fairly comfortable, but I'm not satisfied. How do you encourage them to get started?
yeah, the question about I feel I could do more, that comment is you probably can. I mean, let's just assume you probably can. The question is, do you want to? And there are some people that say, come to me and say, "Oh, Bryan, I could never run a marathon." And I, yeah, you probably could, but do you want to? And if the answer is no, or some version of no, then do something else.
Yeah.
Find out what that passion is that excites you and go after that. If the answer is, yeah, I really would like to run a marathon, then let's figure out how to do it. You don't start off running, 20 miles on the first day. You start off running 1, and then 2, and then 3, and then you can do it. So you got to figure out what is it you're passionate about and you really enjoy doing, and go after that.
Yeah.
There was some research by it's a UK nurse or that worked with people that were kind of at the end of their life, and she wrote a book on kind of regrets, and she asked a bunch of her patients kind of where is it you have the most regrets, in essence. And they said, it's not, I don't have regrets about the things I did as much as the things I didn't do.
Yeah.
So for that person that, maybe kind of, it's like, oh yeah, I can't do this as much anymore. It's okay. What do you want to do? And then let's figure out a path to do that.
Yeah.
Is where kind of make sure we're steering in the right direction.
So I think the yeses and the nos are the easy ones. I'm not going to let you off the hook on that. So
right? No, go ahead.
Here we go. So I ask you, I could never run a marathon, and you say, oh, do you want to? And my response is yes, but.
Okay.
and the but is where my fears, my doubts, my insecurities come in. Is that I would like to, but I've never done. I've never experienced it. I don't think I can. All those kind of things. What are some of the things that when you're talking to people about ambition and goals and things, what are some of the things that they put in after the but, and how do you help them get past that obstacle?
I'm too old, I'm too fat, I'm too tired, I don't have enough money, I don't have enough time. I mean, those are the common ones I often hear.
Yeah.
And my response is they're excuses in many cases. If you really want it, let's look at those. I'm too old. The oldest person to run a marathon was 100. You didn't make any. I was going to say he didn't break any records, but he probably did in his age class.
Yeah.
So he started it, I think, running marathons in his 80s. So you may be too old to run to qualify for the Boston Marathon.
Yeah.
And even that's questionable. So I'm too old. There are probably older people that have done what you've done.
Yeah.
I'm too fat. I'm not in shape. Okay. You don't need to run a marathon tomorrow, but let's say in a year, what do you need to do in a year? You can accomplish a lot around weight loss, around getting into shape in a year. You want to start your own business. You don't have to start it today because maybe you're working and you need that. You've got kids at home and you need that income. All right. What can you do today that can move you to that path? I don't have enough time. I don't have enough money. I hear that a fair amount. We all have the same amount of time. We all have 168 hours in the week. How we choose to use that 168 hours is where it varies.
Yeah.
And so if this is something that's important to you, then figure out how to build it into the 168 hours. I always think, okay, if the president of the United States can get out and exercise, or any CEO can get out and exercise, maybe you can too. But don't start off saying I'm going to exercise 7 days a week. Start off saying I'm going to walk 2 days a week. I don't have enough money. We don't all have the same amount of money. We all have different levels of it. But figure out, okay, what can I do to save? I talked to a couple people who wanted to start their own business. I talked to 3 people who told me the same story. And they said, we knew financially it was going to be challenging. We own our own home. We didn't want to lose our home. And so that was something that was kind of non-negotiable.
Yeah.
How do we protect our home in case the business goes out? And so all 3 of them said we spent a fair amount of time really paying down, and in 1 or 2 of the cases, paying off our mortgage, because then that took a big worry out of it. So figure out those things, kind of what is that excuse you're saying? And then let's back into it and say, okay, what can I do to get rid of that excuse? What can I get rid of? So, what can I do about the time? What can I do about money? What can I do about age? Nothing about age, but you can still get in shape.
You're going to get older regardless, right? It's a question of you get older with or without what you've done.
Right. So go out and you got to really look at that. Is that an excuse? Is it a legitimate excuse? And most of them aren't, in my mind, kind of legitimate reasons for not doing something.
Yeah. No, it's interesting because there's always a but. Everyone's always got fears and doubts and things. Okay, so here's another question for you. And this is one of the things that I've struggled with a little bit in terms of questions and eyebrows being raised more than anything. Like, oh, are you doing that? Is this idea of passion versus obsession. Now, think about how many hours you put into training, how many hours you did running and cycling and stretching and eating and doing all of those bits and pieces that you needed to do. I'm assuming you have other responsibilities in life. And something along those lines. If you look at CEOs, again, I think Elon Musk has been said to work 27 hours a day or something ridiculous along those lines. They're obviously passionate about what they do, but they move, or a lot of people have to move into obsession in order to reach the heights or the levels of success they want to get to.
Yeah.
How do you, when people often ask the question, I'm getting a little bit obsessed, and it's got a negative connotation. What's your thoughts on that word, and how do you see that playing out and being tied to success?
You've got to, if you are going to reach the top, there's got to be a certain level of obsession in many cases. And you talked about some of the CEOs, most big CEOs are going to miss kids' birthday parties. They're not going to be home for every dinner. They're going to be traveling a lot, and they're giving up something for something else. And so you have to prioritize where you want to spend your time. When I was training for the Tahoe 200, I was exercising 30 hours in some weeks. So as I really got the high end, that's almost, that's more than a part-time job.
Yeah.
If people work 40 hours a week, I'm pretty close to that. And I knew I was going to have to give something up. And I kind of break things, in my book, I kind of break things down into 3 different categories. It's that sleep, you're going to sleep about 8 hours a day. Okay. So that's 56 hours. You've got work or school or kind of, if you're a stay-at-home parent, that is the role. And then you've got everything else, kind of that life where it's you're eating, you're watching TV, you're reading a book, you're going out and shopping, those 3 buckets.
Yeah.
And so I knew in those 3 buckets, and the life one is family events, going to kids' soccer games, stuff like that. I knew in those 3 buckets, I was going to exercise a lot more.
Yep.
And so something's going to come out of my 168 hours. I knew it couldn't be sleep out of that bucket.
Not when you're training that hard. Yeah.
No, in fact, I was sleeping more.
Yeah.
So I had to increase that one. And I have had the flexibility, because I'm run my own consulting practice, where I could reduce some of my client load. And that allowed me, because I didn't want to give up on family events. So it may have reduced my income in some places. And so that was a values decision I made. Other people will say, I don't want to reduce the income, or I can't, or I shouldn't. So I'm going to spend less time, doing other things. And so you're constantly balancing those things out, to get to the CEO, and most of the CEOs I talk to, they missed out on some things. And so, I don't know where that line is between, obsession and passion. But if you're going to reach a very high level, you're going to be more closer to the obsession, or maybe over the line a little bit.
How do you bring people with you on that? Because you need a team around you, right? Especially those people who are close to you. They don't necessarily need to agree, but they need to support. Like, if I think about my wife, she doesn't like that I go to the gym. She doesn't like that I eat chicken and green beans. She doesn't like that the freezer is full of white fish and boring things. She doesn't like that I have to cook separate. She understands that I need to do it, and she supports me. And then after I've competed, then it's like, let's go and live normal life. And I'm like, yes, I can balance things over time. But there are some conversations that we've needed to have, that I've had to establish boundaries. She's had to establish boundaries, and we've had some pretty challenging conversations around it. But again, we're a team. What are some of those conversations that either you had to have, or people you've worked with have had to have? And do you have any advice for people when they push this new level of excitement and passion that they're going to have with significant others around it?
Yeah, I think you hit what you just said, when you were talking about your wife, is we're a team. And that's how my wife and I look at it as well, is we are a team, and that team is the most important part. And so we would have the conversations, and she knows, okay, I'm going to be training, for a good portion of our, not in the last couple of years, but prior to that, I would do something one year, she would do something the next year. And so we would balance that off. And so I still have to hold up my end of the bargain. So when I was training for Tahoe 200, she wasn't training for anything big. When I finished, then she started training for an Ironman. And so the roles reversed, and now my job is to support her. So it is, you hit it really well, Dan, is we're a team. We all know what the bigger goal is. I am a better person when I go out and run or bike ride. I'm a better father. I'm a better husband. And so there have been times where, if, I haven't been for a bike ride or a run, she'll go, "Hey, hon, maybe you ought to go for a bike ride," which is a euphemism for you're driving me to get out of the house and go do something.
We've had those conversations. Do you need to have a workout?
Yeah.
Yes.
But we've spent a lot of time. It's like, okay, how can I do this and you're still getting what you need?
Yeah. It's like I say, there's so many crossovers between the challenges you put yourself through physically, business, all of these skills intermingle, and personal, private, all public and business and home and all those kind of things. I don't think you can separate it. And I think you said at the beginning is it's, you notice that there's crossover, and there's crossover in so many areas. I know there's crossovers in how I'm disciplined. I'm lucky now, and I've also got to think about my daughter. She's 4.5 years old. She's observing me, and she learns through observation, right? So I have to mind my mouth a little bit. But now she's seeing me training and challenging myself, and she's been to competitions. And she calls me Daddy Muscles, which is, for me, is phenomenal, because it's a reinforcer of what I do. But also I know I'm kind of imprinting, hopefully, positive value. So when she gets a bit older, she's making the right choices. We're kind of almost approaching time. What's the one piece of advice, if people are listening, take one thing away from today, what do you think that should be?
I mean, we all have these ideas in our head of what we may want to accomplish in life, at work, wherever. And at times we put up kind of these limits, or put up these boundaries. And you talked about it earlier. It's like, I'd like to, but, and then there's some excuse. Let's try to get rid of those excuses. And I'm a firm believer is those limits we put in our head aren't really the limits. We all have some limits. I am more than likely not going to be able to ride the Tour de France in a competitive fashion. And so, yes, that is a likely, limit. But there's other limits we put in our head, and I think they stop us from going further than we probably could. And so how do you get rid of those limits in your head? And that's a lot of what I talk about in the book. And it's like, kind of try to get rid of those limits and go maybe a little bit further. Okay. So if you're saying, hey, I want to train for a half marathon, think about training for a marathon, or put that goal in your head.
Exactly. I think, like you said, if we think about tomorrow, we can't do it tomorrow. But if we put it 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, if we have that long-term perspective that you're talking about, we can pretty much achieve anything.
We do. And one of the things I hadn't mentioned, I'll mention here, is kind of the title of the book is called Epic Performance. And what EPIC stands for, and it goes into that, what you were just talking about, is the E is, how do you envision long-term? How do you envision 20, 30, 40 years out? What do you want, when you're at the end of your finish line, what do you want to have accomplished or done, or, so that's the E, envision. The P is, how do you put a plan in place in order to do it? You got to set some sort of plan. This is how I'm going to do it. I'm not going to do it all today. I'm going to do some today, some tomorrow, and then so on. The I is, how do you iterate to that plan? How do you start small? You don't start off running a marathon. You start off running 1 mile, then 2 miles, and 3 miles. Start small, build that confidence up, which we talked about, and then go into it. The C is, how do you collaborate with others who've done it? If I wanted to start a podcast, like, I would call you up, Dan, and say, hey, Dan, I'm thinking about starting a podcast. Point me in a direction. You've done it. You're successful at it. So learn from those people around you that were successful and not. And then the last one is performance. So it's epic performance is, you got to go out and do it. You got to persevere through the hard time. You've got to the start line. Now let's get to the finish line. So that's kind of, and what I wanted the book to be is kind of some practical tools that people can walk away. It's like, okay, I want to start my own business. How can I start? Or I want to run a marathon. So that's epic performance.
Beautiful. I love it. Like you say, envision, let's think bigger. Let's let go of those limitations. And then, eventually we'll get to that point. We'll look back and think, oh, why didn't I start sooner? So we can let go of that age excuse as well. Bryan, this has been phenomenal. I think let's grab a copy of the book. If people want to learn a little bit more other than the book, is there a way they can stay connected?
Yeah, the best way is 2 ways you can kind of connect up with me. One is go to my website, which is epicperformances.com. And so it's EPIC, performances with an S.com. And you can connect up with me there. I'm always interested in people connecting up with me on LinkedIn, sending me a note. And it's Bryan Gillette, just like the razor blade. I love it when somebody says, hey, I heard your podcast. Here's something big I'm looking to do. I love to hear those stories.
Perfect. I'll try and put this as a snippet on LinkedIn, and we'll see if we can get some people to throw their challenges your way so we get to hear about it.
That's great. Thanks, Dan.
Bryan, this has almost been exciting enough to get me to lace up my running shoes again. But yeah, and actually this morning was one of those days where I was like, I don't ever want to do it. So I'm glad I did, because if I come onto this conversation and had that excuse in the back of my head, I'd have been in trouble. But thanks for your wisdom. Thanks for sharing your lessons. And well, I look forward to hearing what the next adventure and challenge is going to be in the future.
Dan, wonderful talking to you. Thank you.